Will we get going? So welcome everyone. My name is Patrick Paul Walsh. I'm from University College Dublin. The incoming president of CISI, and I'll just turn to John Evans, the secretary, just to read the minutes of the last meeting before we get into the main business of today.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, the last meeting was the sixth and final ordinary meeting of the 175th session of the Society, and it was held on the 26th of May 22 online and at offices at IBEC. The meeting was also the annual general meeting of the 175th session. So the meeting opened with Society business, including reports from its officers, the election of new council, and the new President Paul Walsh. There then followed a paper entitled 175 Years of Mismeasuring Ireland, and that was presented by Alan de Bromhead and authored by Alan de Bromhead, Alan Fernilock, and Cormac O'Brien. The proposal or the vote of thanks was made by John Fitzgerald, and that was seconded by Jennifer Banham. And then there were contributions from various people from the floor. Following the discussion and the responses from the author, the President thanked those who had contributed and brought the 175th session to a close.
Okay, thank you, John. So we're in this venue in the RDS, and we're very thankful to our hosts. There's a nice cup of coffee for people who came in present, and we're obviously trying out this OWL system, so hopefully when you're online you enjoy it. It picks up, just to warn people in the room, it picks up all noises, and the camera tracks the noises. You have to be careful when you're speaking. But on to the main business of today. So we're delighted to have Dr Esmond Birnie and Dr Graham Brownlow. Dr Esmond Birnie is from Ulster University Business School, and Graham Brownlow is from the Queen's Management School. The paper is entitled "When Worse is Better: Economic Policy Making in the Two Irelands of the Mid-1950s." And then we will have two discussants afterwards, but go ahead for the next 40 minutes or so. We give the floor to you. I think one is sharing the slides and one is talking, so fire ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. I think the way to do it is I'll speak to the slides. We don't have very many, and I think Greg is going to probably come in then on the Q&A and so forth. So thank you very much from both of us for, as it were, having us, and apologies that we can't join you in person. I've just been teaching, so it would be practically impossible. So, when worse is better, really considering the two major strategic documents relating to the economy here in Northern Ireland, Isles and Cuthbert's book, and in the Republic, T.K. Whitaker's Economic Development Report. So it's now almost 65 years since the Whitaker report was published in 1958. And it is 65 years since Isles and Cuthbert's book on the Northern economy published in the previous year, 1957. So Graham and myself thought it was a suitable time to do an exercise and compare and contrast. And in particular, what we want to particularly highlight and consider in this afternoon's presentation is a contrast between the extent to which Whitaker's economic development was implemented to some large extent, when Isles and Cuthbert's book, or the content book, was pretty comprehensively ignored by the governing authorities. I just note those 2 points about terminology. For shorthand purposes, I'm going to call both the book and the document strategies. Possibly some of you might quibble with that, but I think it's reasonable. They took a strategic approach to the economy. And I'm going to use the term Republic of Ireland sometimes anachronistically, obviously, when I'm talking about pre-1950 as well. Okay, now obviously there's a context to those two very significant documents. but they were published in the late 1950s. So we do need to contextualize in terms of the state of the two Irish economies in 1957, 1958. So that table gives you results for the level of GDP head of the population, 1938, 1950, and 1960, using two data sources, Geary and Stark in the black figures, and from the Kennedy Giblin McHugh book for the one shown in red, and comparing to the UK average. So in the 1950s, in both cases, levels of GDP per person substantially UK average, but more so in the case of the Republic of Ireland. And obviously, we can also look at rates of economic growth. Whereas in the 1926 to 38 period, Republic of Ireland growth was considerably higher than that of the Northern Ireland level of GDP. That position was reversed during the period 1938 to 1950. Now, interestingly, for the 1950s, the rates of economic growth in the two Irish economies were pretty similar. But it may well be that there was something of a lagged perception. In other words, commentators and indeed governments and observers were relying more on the experience pre-50 as opposed to what the most up-to-date figures would actually have shown. Also look at context in terms of employment levels. In both economies, there was decline in total employment in the 1950s, but more so in the case of the Republic. Another very important point about context, and one that is certainly very strongly demonstrated in both documents, particularly in the case of Whitaker's, is the continued very strong high representation of farming in the regional or national economies, as the case would be. So in 1950, it was still the case that roughly 1 in 6 of the total NI labour force were in agriculture. In the Republic of Ireland, it was just over 2/5, so still very considerable percentages. And for comparisons, we show there the range for the regions in Great Britain. Perhaps the indicator which struck policymakers most strongly, which bore down most strongly on policymakers in the case of the Republic of Ireland, was to do with population in the 1950s, and in particular, out-migration. So in 1950, the total level of population in Northern Ireland was 1.37 million, but strictly speaking, I should say 1951 from the population census. And in the Republic, it was 2.96 million. The Republic's population declined in the 1950s, whereas Northern Ireland's grew by approximately 50,000. And you'll see we presented it in the form of an index number. The total population size of the Republic of Ireland was flat, comparing 1971 to 1926, whereas there was quite a considerable growth in Northern Ireland, 13% by 1961, 22% by 1971. So context, and in particular, can we sort of try, albeit very much high-level summary of performance? I think it's reasonable to conclude that the two documents, Isles and Cuthbert and Whitaker, were written in a context of economic underperformance, both Irish economies underperforming, so compared to the UK average, but in the case of the Republic of Ireland, more so. I'm going to say something, or this slide is going to say something about similarities between the two economies in the period roughly 1955 to 1960, during the time when the two documents were being finalized and indeed published and then implemented as the case may be. Now, as you might expect, in terms of the logic of our argument, we're going to spend more time looking at differences because we're trying to explain the different experience of the two documents, but we can't ignore the fact that there were many similarities between the two economies, and this was recognized in the two documents. Both recognized that in some sense the capital stock was not large enough to guarantee full employment. Isles and Cuthbert linked that to a point, and it was quite a neoclassical form of analysis, that wages were not flexible downwards in the way that perhaps they have been in this era of the labour market. Whitaker stressed the extent to which, as it were, the savings rate in the Republic, and he did make attempts to estimate what savings were, was not sufficiently high. Both had a lot of emphasis on agriculture, hinted at that point already. Indeed, in terms of the number of pages in the Whitaker document, it's roughly a third relate to farming and agriculture and food processing, roughly 1/3, 100 pages. The share in the Isles and Cuthbert book is also considerable, though not as large. And in both documents, there is a very strong emphasis on a need to competitiveness of the two economies of the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland economy, particularly in terms of levels of productivity, labour productivity. However, in Isles and Cuthbert, that emphasis fed through into more of an empirical analysis. There are a lot of numbers, whereas there are almost no numbers with respect to productivity in Whitaker, although he does argue that it presented a challenge. But there were considerable differences between the two documents, north and south, as it were, both in terms of context and in terms of content. This is worth bearing in mind as we come to consider why there was a different experience in terms of the implementation of the two documents. We weren't really starting from the same, as it were, starting position in the case of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland economies. You could characterize Southern Irish economy as a late industrial sector, characterized obviously by the legacy of protectionism in the 1930s, continuing into the 40s and early 1950s. But already in the 1950s, Northern Ireland was experiencing what you might call early deindustrialization. Now, there's an interesting point here of which is more challenging to policymakers. Undoubtedly, both are challenging, being a late starter, being an industrializer, and being a deindustrializer. But I think there could be an argument that there are some advantages in terms of being a late starter, in terms of being able to learn from other examples, in terms of being able to adopt the most up-to-date capital and technology and know-how. And perhaps, and this is a point we'll return to, there could be an institutionalness in the Northern Ireland economy in the sense that there was a very strong relationship between certain industrial sectors, which were old staple industry sectors, and the institutions of government. Perhaps that distorted economic policy, which is a point we will return to. Also, in terms of differences and contrast, the Republic of Ireland, in terms of GDP, income per head, was poorer. And there is an interesting contrast in terms of population and migration. Undoubtedly, policymakers in Dublin in the mid to late 50s were troubled by the high levels of migration and hence the impact on the total level of population and some sort of broader sense of the viability of the autonomous national state and economy. In the case of Northern Ireland, the perceptions around migration were quite contrasting, and the policymakers were actually most concerned not by out-migration, although out-migration was occurring. They were concerned about levels of in-migration, and hence the policy of work permits restricting opportunities to take up vacancies in the labour market, restricting it to people who were of Northern Ireland origin. Now, this work permit policy, it has to be said, and this is the point we'll return to later, was sort of directed in both directions, both south and west. So it was limiting the scope for people to come from Great Britain into the Northern Ireland labour market, as well as obviously limiting the scope for people to migrate from the south into Northern Ireland to work in Northern Ireland. Further difference in which I think undoubtedly impacted the experience of the two documents, the characteristics of the authors linked to the parameters or terms of references which had been set for the two documents. So we have an interesting contrast in terms of the authors. All of them had obviously training in economics at the higher education university level, but the two Northern Ireland authors, Cuthbert over there on the left-hand side and Isles in the centre, they were academics, indeed academics at the time when the book was being written, based in Queen's University Belfast. Whereas Whitaker, TK Whitaker, was a civil servant, and indeed a very senior civil servant in the finance department. So I suppose maybe the conclusion to be drawn, perhaps, I think more than perhaps, should be drawn from the experience of the two documents is if you want a document to actually change policy, get it to be written normally by an insider within the policy-making system rather than by academics. You maybe would argue with that, but that seems to have been what happened in the 1950s in this case. And I think it's also worth bearing in mind the point there at the bottom of the slide. Whitaker, in writing economic development, was given, de facto, was given permission to make wide-ranging radical policy recommendations. Interestingly, when Isles and Cuthbert were commissioned by the Northern Ireland government, by the Department of Commerce in the Stormont Northern Ireland government, they were specifically told that they were not to make policy recommendations. Now, in practice, if you do read the book, you will find there are some policy recommendations. So perhaps inevitably they couldn't avoid talking about policy, and they did. But from the onset, they had that, their hands were somewhat tied behind their back in terms of reference. And that was bound to make a difference, I think. One thing that we think didn't, it turns out not to be that significant, and perhaps this is a surprise in terms of the differential in experience, is the contrast between a region, Northern Ireland as a UK region, albeit with its own devolved government at the time, as opposed to a nation state with a sovereign government. It's an obvious difference, but it's not clear how much direct impact it had on the fate of the two strategies. Now, this may be partly because economic policy making, economic development and policy in the Republic of Ireland was quite constrained in any case, for example, notably in terms of the exchange rate and monetary policy. Now, there may be an indirect argument in which the existence of the sovereign state as a nation, sovereign state, sovereign government had an indirect, in the sense that perhaps policymakers in Dublin, because they were highly committed to what we'll call the independence project, were prepared to be radical in a way that their counterparts in a devolved administration perhaps weren't so. But that you could debate that. Final bullet point, just to note that a point that has become important in recent decades, I don't think is relevant at this stage in the 50s, and it's the point about the fiscal transfer within the UK from the London Exchequer to the Northern Ireland departments, or the Northern Ireland layer of government. This is very much, I think, a consideration during the Troubles and the post-Troubles period. So it develops from the 1970s onwards, and I think is still relevant today. But in the 50s, it's much less clear that there was indeed any, or certainly there wasn't a substantial net transfer from London to Belfast in the mid-1950s. Now, there was some debate about the scale of it at the time. Professor Thomas Wilson, the economist, around about 1950, 1956, there are various figures are pushed back and forth. But I think the bottom line is at that point in the mid-50s, the fiscal transfer was still in absolute and indeed proportional terms quite small. So it's not a significant impact on policy making in Belfast. So let's turn now to the different economic outturns. There was much more upswing in the economy in the Republic of Ireland from the late 50s onwards, and certainly Whitaker's report was noted and noticed and to some degree applied. Now, of course, we're not going to be naive and argue that every change in the economy was because of a change in stance or the publication of a major policy document. But I think some credit should be given to, as it were, the ideas, as well as external factors and other economic conditions and structural change and so on and so forth. In both Irish economies, economic growth accelerated, but more so in the Republic of Ireland when you compare the 60s to the 50s. Isles and Cuthbert's survey of the Northern Ireland economy was really very much downgraded by the policymakers. Now, we say that for two reasons, or pieces of evidence. First of all, publication was substantially delayed. It's true, Isles and Cuthbert did take some time to produce their final, as it were, draft or version, and I think Graham could give more detail on that. But it was commissioned in 1948, substantially finished in 1955. So that's quite a long gestation period, certainly, for a policy document. But it took a further 2 years to be published, and it looks as though the reason for that was undoubtedly that the Stormont government was sitting on it, was embarrassed, didn't know what to do with it. Second piece of evidence for the downgrading, it was not given the sort of usual status that such documents would have been given of being a sort of official so-called command paper. It was simply published as a book, which is the form we have it in. Now, in the case of Whitaker, there's a clear read across from economic development, the Whitaker report, to the first programme for economic expansion. We can see that, for example, in the growth targets. They were both published at more or less the same time. Well, I think the programme was published in November '58, and I think 10 days later, the economic development was published. So, it was giving the public, the commentariat, an opportunity to compare and see the links and the logic, and arguably that was a very sensible and correct thing to do. So the contrasting fates of the two strategies, and you might think the subheading there maybe exaggerates, but I don't think it really does. I think this is what happened. One strategy Isles and Cuthbert, it sank into oblivion, and the other became the subject of adulation, and has continued to be substantially. Whitaker's reputation and of his report has, if anything, strengthened over succeeding decades. Now, how are we to explain this? Well, I think in terms of the situation here in Belfast in Northern Ireland, perhaps it was a case of the government to business relationship being too close. So you had strong rent seeking going on. This is obviously at the form or shape or context of the Stormont government, high percentages of MPs from the old industries, notably linen, textiles. So 2 of the ministers of commerce in the 1950s had backgrounds in the traditional industries. 12 of the 14 Belfast Stormont MPs were either proprietors or owners of textile businesses. Between 1921 and 1945, admittedly before the direct period, we're considering 70% roughly of Stormont's MPs were from the Unionist Party, and of them, roughly 2/5 had a background in either owning or managing textile businesses. So there was that. And I think also importantly, and this is back to what I was saying right at the start in terms of the slides, in terms of the economic context, the economic context in the mid-50s was more favourable to Northern Ireland than the Republic of Ireland, albeit perhaps the most up-to-date, if they'd been available at the time, which they weren't. Comparison of economic growth would have suggested that some gaps narrowed or disappeared. But there was a complacency in Northern Ireland based on comparison precisely to the Republic of Ireland. Now, there is one, well, a number of examples of this, but in the 1958 Northern Ireland general election, in its manifesto at that time, the Unionist Party made the following statement about the Southern economy. So this is what it said. The Republic of Ireland economy can only keep going as it is with the aid of emigration on a massive scale, high tariffs and remittances, in spite of which its unemployment problem is severe. So clearly a very negative view taken from Belfast looking down towards what was happening south of the Irish border. In terms of the Republic of Ireland and the reception or receptiveness indeed to Whitaker, 2 reasons why the Republic of Ireland government was open to relatively radical prescriptions. First of all, the seriousness of the situation perhaps weakened vested interests. So it was possible to act without being tied up by rent-seeking and stakeholders. And secondly, the situation looked so bad, to use that cliche, an existential problem, that there was no reason to be complacent. And here we'd point to the memo which Whitaker wrote to his minister, the then Finance Minister Ryan, in 1957, where he said, look, we either do something very radical to shake up the economy, or we need to think about whether independence remains viable. So he couched it in so binary and stark terms. So there's certainly no complacency being allowed for there. As we draw to a close here in terms of the presentation, we'd obviously be very happy to, as time allows, to take questions and hear your thoughts. Little postscript. The 2 strategies were very largely back to back. There was little or no consider of cross-border or linkages between Northern Ireland economy and the Republic of Ireland economy. Now, the evidence for this is Whitaker's report, so roughly 200 pages long, mentions Ireland 6 times, and it's chiefly in terms of the potential to export from the Republic to the north. So he talks about agriculture, biscuits, whiskey, turf, and moving electricity, surplus electricity, and some sort of grid linkage. So just 6 mentions, and always quite brief. Isles and Cuthbert said very little, similarly, very little about what was happening in the southern economy. There were 2 major and quite negative mentions of the Republic. One was in terms of the point I've already mentioned in the context of work permits, that there was something of a fear that in the Northern Ireland labour market, with relatively high levels of unemployment, higher than GB, and that having been so since or throughout the interwar period too, that situation would be made worse by potential migration of workers coming from the south into Northern Ireland, unless, of course, the policymakers intervened as they did to an extent through the work permit system. And then the other mention, this is another quite interesting point that they argued. They argued in effect that the 1937 constitutional territorial claim on Northern Ireland from the Republic constituted or led to a sort of risk premium. In other words, uncertainty about Northern Ireland's status fed through into investors requiring a higher return. And then obviously also in a sort of very neoclassical sense, the quantity of investment would, other things being equal, be reduced. But they did mention the Republic of Ireland on one occasion in a positive light. The 2 major mentions there are quite negative, but positively, the Industrial Credit Corporation was hailed as a potential precedent, which the Northern Ireland authorities might wish to consider or indeed copy in terms of trying to convert the considerable number of quite small and arguably undercapitalized traditional family-run businesses, which still dominated the stock of firms in Northern Ireland at that time, to convert them into public companies and to expand, et cetera, et cetera. So both jurisdictions were very much at this time trying to lift themselves up without much reference to the other economy. And from the perspective of the early and indeed now 2022, early 21st century, that may seem a bit strange, but it is the way that both documents were written and the way they turned out. That said, in terms of if we think about T.K. Whitaker's influence after 1958, I think particularly thinking about this from the perspective of Belfast or from here in Northern Ireland, he should certainly be given a lot of credit for his impact on North-South relations, not just political, not just economic, but obviously also political. So it may be significant that he was obviously born in County Down in Ross Trevor. He had a strong friendship with the, at times, northern-based economics professor Charles Carter, although Carter did later move to, I think, England. And Whitaker's influence was very strong in terms of arguably a moderation of policy towards Northern Ireland, which occurred during the premierships of both Lemass and Lynch. And Whitaker did play a key role in the first meeting between the Dublin Taoiseach and the Northern Prime Minister in January '65, which happened here in Belfast at Stormont, and indeed Whitaker came to that meeting. And then subsequent meetings, I think one also in 67 with Jack Lynch and Whitaker's influence still being felt there. Then very importantly, the memo that was written by Whitaker on the 11th of November 1968, a note on North-South policy, which I think quite importantly was trying to exercise a calming influence, which would become very significant and important in the following year, given obviously the regrettable way that things were developing in Northern Ireland at that time. So thank you very much. Both of us were both very grateful for this opportunity and very pleased to hear your views and field any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Esmond. Would you mind stopping sharing the slides?
Yeah, I will do that, certainly. No problem, Patrick. Thank you.
I'm going to, we're going to have our first vote of thanks from Kieran Casey. He's here and present, and he's from University of Limerick, an economic historian. You go ahead.
Thanks a million. Thanks very much. I'd like to thank the authors for a really interesting paper. Economic development's a plan I'm much more familiar with and on which I'll focus my comments. The increased academic readiness to critique the paper in recent years has been very welcome. For decades, Irish academics were remarkably slow to engage with the actual text of economic development. Such was its reputation that myself and several others I've spoken to initially wondered if we were reading the wrong document. Esmond and Graham provide valuable context for the agricultural employment shares in British regions in Ireland in 1938, 1950 and 1960. Agricultural employment was falling everywhere in Western Europe, but the impact of this was directly commensurate with its initial share. In the 7 decades from 1926, the Republic of Ireland lost well over 500,000 agricultural jobs. The authors rightly note the core focus of economic development was, quote, and this is from Economic Development, primarily on raising the efficiency and volume of production in agriculture and in industries based in agriculture. But employment in the sector continued to fall inexorably. While almost all jobs create growth over the rest of the century came from services, to which economic development devoted just 13 pages. As the authors observe, the Whitaker plan fleetingly acknowledged that free trade would inevitably come sooner or later. As I've argued elsewhere, this was almost certainly deliberate. Whitaker was evangelical about trade liberalization, which he pursued doggedly throughout the 1960s. Political sensitivities, however, precluded a frontal assault. Perhaps the best source in Irish industry in the period is the Committee on Industrial Organisation. Its interim report in 1962 gave a sobering insight into the state of Irish manufacturing firms. The committee warned that, without urgent action, few would survive the transition to free trade. It outlined a litany of problems, including small firms, a lack of vertical integration, short production runs, high unit wage costs, inadequate mechanisation, underutilized production capacity, poor design of Irish goods, a lack of international marketing capacity, and cutthroat competition between Irish firms in export markets. Economic development did little to address most of these, especially design and marketing. Actually, there, from a personal point of view, as someone whose kind of grandfather owned one of these firms, I'd also throw in idiot sons. The authors, there's a huge thing, and they recognize this, of kind of family firms and people taking over and kind of very bad capacities and that preventing mergers. The authors make the important observation that Ireland had some of the advantages of a late starter. This is only of value, however, if the country is receptive to lessons from outside. As Frank Barry has observed in the past, the Stacey May report pointed Ireland to the example of Puerto Rico, which had successfully used a low corporate tax rate within a large trading bloc to attract US investment. Contrary to the accepted narrative, economic development was not universally well received in publication. The World Bank dismissed the entire thrust of the strategy out of hand and again pointed Whitaker to the Puerto Rico example. Again, the model was ignored. Much of the contemporary and retrospective acclaim enjoyed by economic development rests on its coincidence with the growth up to the 1960s. The legacy of this interpretation has been largely damaging. Far too little has been made of the fact that growth was already strong at the time of its publication, and in GNP terms actually fell back slightly afterwards. Ascribing short-term growth to a plan or strategy is almost always misguided. The structural changes take far longer to have any meaningful effect. Unfortunately, misinterpretations about the goals and track record of economic planning disheartened the Department of Finance in the 1970s and 1980s. Planning of all hues was abandoned on the basis that the global economy had become too unpredictable to set growth targets. This had serious implications in terms of fostering indigenous industries, spatial planning, and infrastructure provision. The consequences of all are which very much so with us. Esmond and Graham raise the important relationship between civil servants and ministers. A key consideration from the planning perspective is the length of terms in office. Ministers for finance served an average of just under 3 years, less than half the terms enjoyed by secretaries. Such short terms militate against long-term planning, both in terms of the incentives and bandwidth. Even the most capable minister will need an extended period to settle into the job. This suggests that much of the long-term perspective will need to come from officials. The best contribution a minister might make is to start the planning process without much confidence of being in office to see its fruits. Another issue the authors raise is the political receptiveness to economic development in the context of the late 1950s. There's widespread recognition that policy shifts are often easier at a time of crisis. In some respects, Ireland did make use of the Great Recession, especially cutting through the thicket of tax breaks which fatally undermined yield. But there were major lessons not learned, which have either already come back to haunt us or threaten to in the future. The first is the patent inability of the construction industry to provide anything like a steady and adequate supply on its own. There are great models to follow here, both internationally and in our own recent past, and a reluctance to draw on them as a puzzle. The second is the over-reliance on one sector, both for the exchequer and for direct and indirect employment. One of the longer-term consequences of the Great Recession is that it further deepened and extended our dependency on foreign investment. Most people who are aware of its existence still consider economic development to be vitally important, the economic blueprint for modern Ireland. More robust and empirical analysis is very welcome, and Graham and Esmond have contributed significantly in that regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now I'd like to give Frank Barry from Trinity College Dublin the floor for a second vote of thanks.
Hi, Paul. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Yeah, great. Everybody south of the border has heard of the Whitaker report. Very few people, I imagine, even north of the border have heard of Isles and Cuthbert. I first came across it, or it was first referred to me by Graham about 10 or 15 years ago. But until this paper arrived in my inbox, I hadn't actually realized that the reports were coterminous with each other. So I think it's a very interesting exercise to engage in, to compare the two. There's very little in the paper on foreign direct investment. Now, admittedly, that was only really taking off sort of at this time, but it strikes me another related project that one could engage in that would be quite interesting is to compare the reports on Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland by the Boston consultancy, Arthur D. Little. It did a report on Northern Ireland in 1959 and one on the South in 1967, but there was another one that's only obtainable in the National Archives, a secret report for the Shannon Development Authority that was done in 1960 again by a different US agency. And it strikes me they would be interesting to look at as well and do a kind of comparative analysis similar to what Esmond and Graham have done here. The main thing I think I disagree with them on is the sense which comes out more clearly in the paper, I think, than in Esmond's presentation, is that the success of the Whitaker report was somehow inevitable. I think it wasn't, and that's really what I wanted to spend most of my time on. But there's a question to be asked, though, is how revolutionary were either of these analyses? Back in 2008, the 50th anniversary of the Whitaker report, there was an international conference brought together of people like economic historian Nick Crafts and a lot of others. And these people got in touch with me and maybe other people who were presenting, and they said, what is special about this document? It reads as straightforward conventional economics to me. And that's how it reads to me as well. Whitaker's messages don't come out as clearly in economic development as they do in his J. Sissy paper from 1956, where he presents his macroeconomic understanding of the Irish economy, but he comes across clearly as a supply sider and focuses much more on education than he does in economic development. And I'll say something about this, about his contribution to education more towards the end, but his understanding of trade conditions comes across much more clearly in a series of memos that were exchanged between leading civil servants in 1959 on Ireland's attitude, what our attitude should be towards the European Free Trade Association that was being engineered, created by Britain at the time as a response to the creation of the EEC. And as Kieran says, he comes across as, you know, a very committed free trader. And in fact, in this regard, he was a direct descendant of Brennan and McElligott, the long-term secretaries of the Department of Finance, who'd been there from the 20s onwards, that these were free traders, but it wasn't any sense there wasn't an export-led growth model embedded clearly in Department of Finance thinking. It was just more pure Ricardian comparative advantage. And in that sense, it was purely neoclassical as well. You know, and Whitaker talked both in terms of macroeconomics and in terms of free trade from the perspective of a small economy, making the point that for small economies, Keynesian policies are much less effective because of the high marginal propensity to import, and free trade is much more beneficial to small economies simply because of their size. They can't produce everything efficiently that they want or that they need. So to come on to this issue, was the success of the Whitaker report inevitable? Now, I think it clearly wasn't, in that there are failed states that failed to grasp the opportunity of, you know, digging themselves out of the hole that they've found themselves in. And I think, you know, this is why Whitaker said to the politicians, there's a danger that we might need to go cap in hand back to the United Kingdom and saying, please let us back in. You know, this was a saying to them, you know, there is a danger that we could become a failed state. But the politicians were supportive, you know, as Esmond and Graham point out in the Southern Irish case. And Gareth Fitzgerald has an interesting remark about the decision to publish the Whitaker document, that he said it was to make clear, it was done by Fianna Fáil in order to make clear that this wasn't purely a government strategy or a Fianna Fáil strategy. It was a strategy written by the head of the civil service, and therefore it was apolitical in that sense. So this was a political decision. And really what I want to talk about more than anything else in my remaining few remarks is the way the politicians played the game of liberalizing the economy, that they did it very well in a way that I think doesn't come across in the paper, or at least as clearly as I think it should. How successful was Whitaker? Well, first of all, on macroeconomics, he wasn't successful. He had argued that taxation should be kept down. Instead, it burgeoned, expanded over the 1960s. Clearly, he wasn't a Keynesian. That comes across very clearly in his J. Sissy article from '56. He believed, that Keynesian fiscal expansion would create balance of payments problems. He argued, and this was very important, he argued that Irish wages, if we were to open to trade liberalisation, Irish wages had to the growth of Irish wages had to be kept below UK levels, and this didn't happen. Instead, they grew at 1.5 times the rate of UK wages over the course of the 1960s, which led to massive redundancies and so on. So on macroeconomics, he wasn't successful. On education, as I say, he was. At the time of his death there a few years ago, a few former colleagues of his wrote on various websites about the importance of his work with the National Industrial Economic Council, the forerunner of today's NESC, where he published a report under his chairmanship on manpower policy that introduced the notion that we refer to today as the ladder of comparative advantage. The more educated the workforce, the more complex the products you're able to produce, and this is a way for countries to develop. And we know that Whitaker really ushered in through the bureaucracy the quite challenging notion that Ireland had volunteered to the OECD to have its entire educational system surveyed by the OECD. That was challenging and controversial, and Whitaker ushered that through the bureaucracy. I'm not so sure, whether he was how he worked on the politicians. O'Malley, Donnacha O'Malley took up that notion when the OECD report was eventually published. But that was very important. On trade, let me just say something now on trade, that mostly what people think about, Whitaker's success is in trade liberalization. But actually, if you look at the chronology of trade liberalization, the real thing that kickstarted trade liberalization was Britain's surprise decision to apply to join the European Economic Community in 1961. It took everyone by surprise, and Ireland had no choice but to apply alongside the UK. And this is where the politics of it come in, because the job of advisors is to present advice. The job of politicians is to implement it. And I think we often don't give credit enough to politicians that implementing, difficult reform programs requires playing off different vested interests against each other. And once Ireland applied to join the EEC, we had agriculture, which really is hugely important vested interest. They were now in conflict with the important vested interests of protectionist era industry. And really that I think drove the trade liberalization. And that was years after, that was 1961, several years after the Whitaker report. That's not to say, of course, that outward reorientation is easy. And this is where Kieran mentioned foreign direct investment, that this, to me, and Paul, I think, Paul Walsh has written on this as well, this was a component of really Ireland's dual track reform, the sort of strategy that China adopted, which is that you liberalize part of the economy without challenging existing vested interests. And then once you get some success in that, it's like a steamroller and you can move ahead in that regard. It's a well-known concept amongst development economists. They talk about it with respect to export processing zones, for example. You introduce an export processing zone. If that takes off, that doesn't challenge existing vested interests, but if it takes off, it makes it easier to liberalize the rest of the economy. So the politicians played a very crucial role in that. So as I say, that was a dual track reform strategy. And then I think just two final points. Esmond and Graham talk about, rent seeking in Northern Ireland. There was a lot of political hands in the pie in protectionist era industry in Southern Ireland as well. Cormac O'Grada has talked about how protectionism created a role for the politician as broker. So politicians had a skin in the game of maintaining protectionism. Mary Daly says alternatives would have been available, but these would have deprived the government of potentially beneficial political support. And Tom Garvin makes the point that under Irish protectionism, a lot of well-connected people became rich. So there was vested interests in Southern Ireland as well as Northern Ireland in terms of trying to maintain protectionism in place. And this was why the dual track reform strategy was so important, is that it didn't challenge these vested interests, but really slipped trade liberalization or outward reorientation in through the back door. And why didn't, so we didn't have that possibility in Northern Ireland of playing these vested interests off against each other, which is, as I say, that's the job not of policy advisors like Whitaker and Isles and Cuthbert, but the politicians themselves. So there wasn't that sort of opportunity available there. And of course, one can't deny, Northern Ireland was essentially, a one-party state, not autocratic in the sense of the way we normally think of the term, but you didn't have, changes of government between, changes of power between government and opposition. You didn't have that in Northern Ireland. Lemass said that it was only in Fianna Fáil's second period in opposition in the mid-1950s that they really set themselves the task of sitting down and thinking carefully about the economy. And Lemass was too hard-nosed a politician ever to give any credit to the inter-party government, but really it was the shift of power between Fianna Fáil lost the 48 election. They won in 54, 51, they lost again in 54, they won again in 57. There was this period of electoral competition that, that underlay this huge change in the whole orientation of the Irish economy at that time. So, you know, a great paper, really, really interesting and thought-provoking. So let me congratulate Esmond and Graham on the paper. I'm delighted that it has provoked these thoughts in my own mind. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Frank. That was really excellent. So we're going to open it up to Q&A both in person and online. Just remember to say your name and an institution if you like. So we want to record it in the minutes, and there'll be a request to send in your comments by the secretary at the end. He'll give you the email. We'll put it online as well. So I see Frances Joanne has her hand up. So do you want to take the floor, Frances?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you both authors for the paper, which I must say I found very stimulating. And like Frank has fessed up, I too was unaware of the particular report, the book effectively that had been commissioned and the context of it. And it's fascinating that given the timing and to make this comparison, I think is really worthwhile. So I'd just like to comment just on a couple of things, which echo a little bit of what has been already said by the responses, but maybe add something else as well. I guess the first issue, which is that although it becomes known everywhere as the Whitaker report, for me, what is always a bit misleading about that was this was a government a report written by senior civil servants, of whom Whitaker was the chair, and his name got on the report. And so while he always gave credit to everybody else, he never objected to it being called the Whitaker report. He didn't have it even the Whitaker et al. Report, it was the Whitaker report. So I think there's a sense in which comparing it with a report that was commissioned from two academics is somewhat different. So really what you have there, and it really comes out in the paper today, I mean, the data that were in economic development, well, whatever data were available at the time, they didn't represent the data to illustrate or to look at concepts that were kind of economically driven that economists would normally have looked at. So I think it's just an important piece to realize that was the position, but that in turn meant that he already had all of those civil servants online. So the likelihood of the report being taken up by government, which was already fixed anyway with the mass, if they were happy enough with it, was fairly straightforward. So there's a sense in which saying that it's an issue of, I think, making sure that there's a voice to take up whatever is put forward in the document. But again, I haven't seen the book to which you refer, but I mean, there's a single academic reference in economic development to a Kieran Cross article, which I have read. And there's also, the only other reference is to Bishop Philbin. So I think one of the issues there was that the civil servants had squared up the church not to object to this going outside and changing direction. And that was possibly the equivalent of squaring up social partners today. I'm not sure whether it's a fair comparison, but in terms of a body that might have had a voice. I want to just echo what Frank Barry has just said. I mean, the innovative government changes that were made with regard to what became our export-led growth policy were effectively done by the inter-party government, not by the Fianna Fáil government. But actually, because they were working so well, the Fianna Fáil government took it over and, as it were, raised the stakes to even greater, longer tax holidays and greater levels of grant support. So I think that's it's a really important point. I think that often gets missed. I wondered when I listened to the as I was listening to the paper being read, I mean, what I'm reminded of was there was reference, sorry, let me back off, that when you were talking about it, that the comparison actually in some ways with lack of effectiveness for a report was the Buchanan report written for the Irish government, which was again done by somebody who much more scholarly piece of work, much more in-depth piece of work in many respects, but it was utterly ignored by the politicians and in a way by the civil servants. And Whitaker was still in the government system when that happened. And I think, you know, if you look at the legacy of problems we have today, very many of them are related to our failure to deal with the issues that were actually first brought out in great detail with in the Buchanan report. So I just wanted to say the issue, I think, is right, that the success that Frank has said, the success was not inevitable at all. And in a way, when you look at where the growth came from, it didn't come from where the economic development expected it would come from. So there's a sense in which there is one merit, though, that I would point to, and maybe this is because it seems now to be something more evident. There was a sense in which economic development at least got planning along the budgetary 1-year basis onto a 4 to 5 year basis. And it also, I think, in doing so, gave hope to people that somebody was in control. So what I suppose I would be finishing off by saying is that I think there was a benefit to confidence in Ireland as a result of it, rather than that its content led to where we got to subsequently. Thank you very much for the paper, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Francis. So is there anyone in person wants to ask, or I could go to online? Yeah. So,
Paul, hi, Michael Darcy here. I'm surrounded by economists, therefore I'm loath to make
your speakers there.
an economic comment. So maybe I can just broaden this out a little bit, and particularly the reference to TK Whitaker and his role in all this. It's a very interesting paper, and thank you, Graham and Esmond. I certainly was utterly unaware of it, despite engagement with the Northern economy for 3 decades. So, but I wonder, I sort of a question in mind, the degree to which it merits rescuing from oblivion, perhaps only to the extent that Francis has pointed out about how things can miss things, and that's why they're actually sent to oblivion, right? I actually looked up the portrait of a patriot by Anne Chambers on TK Whitaker, which has a whole chapter devoted to hands across the board in 1963 to 67. And it highlights actually how Whitaker had begun working on developing informal, good working relationships with his counterparts in the North in the 1950s, late 1950s, working off the back of this report. And indeed, when Lemass came to power in 1959, it was clear he already had a purpose in mind for that. And it's interesting that in 1963, when he was in America, he was able to lay the groundwork in a speech for the subsequent Lemass-O'Neill meeting by saying, quite apart from what views one may hold about the reunification of Ireland, is it not common sense that the 2 existing communities on our small island should seek every opportunity of working together in practical matters for their mutual and common good? And I think that's an important part of this that obviously is critical to the role Whitaker played. And second, it goes on to observe, coming to Frank's point about the role of politicians in all this, that actually when he developed a personal relationship with Terence O'Neill, what O'Neill was most interested in apparently was the background and formation of the program of economic expansion, which perhaps argues again for the oblivion that Isles and Cuthbert were sent to, that a reforming politician such as Terence O'Neill was unable to find anything in their document which he saw as helping him to progress things in terms of reforming the Northern Ireland economy. Of course, we know what happened to him and to the economy. And again, the last comment I suppose I have is, Edmund and Graham, do you feel any sort of regret that they weren't, as authors, more aggressive in identifying the structural weaknesses in the Northern Ireland economy, which actually led to the, to what we saw happen in 1968-69, particularly in the labour market? And this mindset of we mustn't have anyone come in for fear we upset what we already have, despite large-scale unemployment, and certainly anyone from the South, which unfortunately at that stage was could be read across into a sectarian context, frankly. So was it a missed opportunity by Cuthbert and Isles to actually take a more progressive and forward-looking view?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. So I might give, before I go around get more questions, I might give Esmond and Graham a chance to reply. I've just one comment that might be of interest because it's a reoccurring theme, is that Whitaker set up a capital investment advisory council in 1956, and I think it's still there. But he had Charles Carter, Loudon Ryan, and Paddy Lynch on it. So there was, if you like, cooperation between academics and the civil servants, so we can have peace there. And it's nice to feel that there's cooperation between the academic civil servant north and south through Whitaker as well. And that's something this society is going to keep pushing on. And that's why we're hybrid today, because we're going to go further with that. But is that okay, Esmond and Graham? Would you like to respond to what you've heard so far?
Do you want to go first, Esmond, or shall I?
Yeah, you go ahead, Graham.
Oh yeah, well, firstly, I thank everybody for their kind comments. I think, okay, so there's an awful lot of food for thought in a lot of those thoughtful comments. I think regarding the vested interest point that Frank was making, I completely accept those. But I think it's something that obviously the paper, we can't go into any great detail about the issue of industrializing or deindustrializing the challenge. I think if I was to explain this in very sort of simple Econ 101 world, I would probably suggest that the clue is probably actually it's in Joseph Schumpeter. It's creative destruction. I think it's not appreciated perhaps as much detail we can go into in this paper, but obviously I've written about elsewhere. Essentially what you had with the staples, and Isles and Cuthbert do talk about this in the report, and they do have some wonderful phrases. They talk about attitudes of restriction, and they talk about the monopoly over the coal import, etc. There's a whole bunch of this sort of stuff, but I think something maybe we don't say enough about the paper is the political leverage that they had to operate under. So the report is actually initially commissioned in 1948, as Esmond said, but actually I've done an awful lot of archival work back in the day on this. As early as 1952, Isles has essentially written a report, and indeed his inaugural at Queen's Belfast in 1946 was about the Northern Ireland economy. So he had a long-standing interest in this sort of thing. So as early as 1952, he's written that analysis. You can see it in the archive, but there's no numbers. And Cuthbert was a statistician who comes in for 3 years. 1955, it's the final report's the impublishable form, but it sits on the shelf for 2 years. And it's actually only when Isles and Cuthbert contribute an essay, Thomas Wilson's editing a book, and he's aware that it's sitting on the shelf, that the report gets published. But when it does get published, all the unionist politicians in the Parliament, as was, are issued with around about a 20-page document, basically decrying the contents of the report. Again, if more detail, I could go into more detail about that, but I don't think there's the time to do that. But the point about Schumpeter is that the staples were acting as the barrier to restructuring the economy, and the industrial grants available in Northern Ireland were an order of magnitude more generous than those available in the South. And when we look at the allocation, and again, I don't want to bore people with previous papers I've written, you see that half the money is going, so supposedly new industry fund, half the money is going to the linen industry. Now this is in the mid-1950s, okay? Linen is mechanized in Belfast right by 1825. So even by Ulster's peculiar, and I can say this, somebody from Ulster, even by Ulster's peculiar standards, 130 years does not constitute new. So I think that those are the sort of political economy. If we had more time and space, yes. And the other point is, I apologize if we give the idea of inevitability. It's certainly not intention. And I mean, I've written elsewhere, and Esmond's written elsewhere in many outlets, in no way success or failure of Whitaker was or not inevitable. Indeed, nor was the fact that the report comes to be known as a Whitaker report. I completely accept it was an editorial type decision. And I mean, if you go back, Charles Carter is very important in Whitaker's thinking. Go back to the studies papers in the 1950s. Carter tackles it head on, basically says, as an English Quaker, I don't feel very confident to say this to you people, but you really need to think about raising the quality of technology and management. And you can do that best through inward investment. So I think that people like Loudon, Ryan, Carter are, I mean, I won't bore you with the lecture I could go into about Whitaker's own economic thinking, which is as Frank alludes to, in some ways far more interesting and far more eclectic than I think a lot of people understand, because Whitaker was a graduate of the external degree at London, a bit like Raymond Crotty, another figure that's sometimes forgotten about. His views were very much influenced by Arnold Plant and Arthur Selden. And his critique, his GCSE paper that Frank mentioned is actually very much a critique of the multiplier. It's not simply an empirical paper about Ireland, it's a theoretical critique of the multiplier. It's actually a theory of what we could call contractionary expansion. Or I think that's right, yeah. In other words, it tries to explain why the multiplier in Irish circumstances will lead to a contraction of the Irish economy. It's quite a fascinating paper because it's totally at variance to the way that if you read administration, things like that, the way Whitaker is presented in economic development, he's not at all the Keynesian figure. Anyway, so that's my slightly or more than slightly rambling attempt to respond. And I'll leave it now to Esmond to show you how it should be done.
No, I don't think that's fair, Graham, but thanks. And thanks to all of you for your comments, particularly to Kieran and Frank. So yeah, I was particularly struck by Kieran's saying how initially some of the global reception of Whitaker was quite negative, e.g. the World Bank. Frank is obviously quite right, both in terms of our paper, but also in terms of the two documents themselves, that there isn't very much on foreign direct investment. Now, looking back on it from our perspective in subsequent decades, that may seem a bit strange, but at the time, that's the way they were written. There isn't much about raising the level of inward investment into either Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland in either document. There's a little bit in Isles and Cuthbert about comparisons between regional development grants and their success or otherwise compared to other highly sensitive, like, for example, Scotland and Wales. But that's about the height of it. And Whitaker's report, if I may use that shorthand, given, and I take the point, it was a collective product amongst a number of civil servants, obviously. It mainly concentrated on raising the level of domestic savings, and there is quite a lot of emphasis in Isles and Cuthbert on an outflow of investment funds from Northern Ireland to Great Britain, and they attempt to explain that in terms of relative levels of rates of return, and back to this point that does keep coming up about inverted commas conservatism of management practice on the part of traditional family-run businesses. At one point, Frank made the point that, particularly in terms of Whitaker, a key point to emphasize, and I entirely agree with him, is that it's very much presenting standard neoclassical and standard, as he put it, Ricardian comparative advantage economics and indeed trade theory. And similarly, in many respects, Isles and Cuthbert is very standard neoclassical economics. So I suppose then, and we attempted to do this in our paper, the challenge is, given as a presentation, given that both documents are presenting very standard economics, why was one much better received than the other? I think Frank has presented some of the sort of political points, which I think are very relevant. And as Graham says, I think the way the institutions were working in Northern Ireland was very much working against any sort of Schumpeterian creative destruction. Just to emphasize that point about the standard economics of Isles and Cuthbert. And, you know, in many ways, I think it's a great shame that it did fall into comparative oblivion. And as so many of the commentators today have said, it's hardly known. I think this is regrettable. To be fair to the book, it didn't entirely escape attention. It took on a form or a life that was probably never intended by the authors. I think it was very much for a number of years used as a standard textbook on the Northern Ireland economy. So it wasn't entirely in vain. I know that in the late 1960s, in the economics teaching at Queen's University Belfast, Isles and Cuthbert was being used as a textbook at that time. So, but that of course wasn't the intent. The intent was to make a commentary about the Northern Ireland economy and to change things, which obviously didn't happen. And I like Professor Ruan's comparison to the Buchanan report, and I think that, yeah, I know of it, and I think that's quite a striking and useful comparison. That again, in that case, the analysis may well be very, sound, as it were, academically, but you need the political conditions to allow receptiveness. Michael Darcy makes the point about, do we regret that the two Northern Ireland-based academics in their book weren't sufficiently radical? I think, to be fair to Isles and Cuthbert, if you read the four, and it's a heavy-going 400 or 500 pages of read, they were radical at a number of points. They, in a sense, they didn't pack their punches regarding, as they perceived it, failures in performance, failures in policy. And they did make specific policy recommendations, and they did attempt to address areas where, as Graham mentioned, the coal trade between GB and Northern Ireland, there was monopoly, and they made suggestions about that. So, to be fair to them, I don't think they were lacking of courage. I think, sadly, it wouldn't have made much difference. If they'd made more radical conclusions, the outcome would have been the same as it was, that they were ignored, that they were comprehensively ignored. I think it is worth reiterating the point I tried to make about the work permits. In terms of standard economics, I think this sort of restriction on supply, I think most economists would say this was a bad policy. To be fair to the Stormont government, because it was applied in both directions, I'm not convinced it should be described as a sort of sectarian policy, because it was, inverted commas, discriminating against potential workers coming from Great Britain as well as from the south. But it is true in the book, Isles and Cuthbert, they particularly refer to, as they termed it, the potential problems of potential labour flows coming in from the south. So again, thank you very much.
Sorry, if I could just add in, because it's all forgotten, and we make passing reference to it in the report in the paper. But in 1956, The Economist did a survey. Again, most people, like Isles and Cuthbert, most people are unaware of. It's called John Bull's Model Ireland, which is about Northern Irish economy, and they actually confront the piece of legislation, Safeguard of Employment, Northern Ireland Act 1947, to give it its real name. They actually, I mean, at that stage, in a document that's actually, the survey is actually very much downplays discrimination. It's actually a very interesting survey of Northern Ireland politics, society, economy. Actually very much downplays discrimination. It sort of points at, I'll actually read the sentence. It has been necessary to put a pale around the province to keep out job and welfare hunting citizens of the Republic in the form of the Safeguard Employment Act. So even The Economist, that was actually very sympathetic in many ways to Northern Ireland, certainly relative to the Republic or the South or Ireland at the stage, even they were saying that. And if I could make a historical postscript on this, I have in my office at Queen's 3 file of the 1973-72 documents about the abolition of that act. Because again, one of the postscripts of that act is, because the UK was not a common labour market, and the Ministry of Labour Northern Ireland said that people from within GB to NI, as well as the south to the north, didn't have freedom of movement. There was actually essentially, in one of these historical ironies, a labour market bordering the Irish Sea. And that actually a lot, as with Denmark, that had similar legislation, it was a stumbling block to the UK's entry into the EEC as was. And so the three boxes I've got are the negotiations at the time of the British lean on Northern Ireland and then direct rule to actually remove the legislation from the statute books because it was seen as one of these historical quirks that a labour market bordering the Irish Sea was seen as incompatible with free markets in Europe. So it's just one of those interesting postscripts, how things turn out. But I think it's well worth the irony that I actually haven't talked about the extent to which the unionists are actually far more pro-EEC than the British Conservatives, which again, you know, they actually, Faulkner took legal advice on whether Northern Ireland unilaterally could join the EEC. You know, there's all sorts of weird, wonderful bits of, again, if you go into the archive, there's all sorts of weird, wonderful bits of legal cases like this about where Northern Ireland stands relative to the rest of the UK. And it's often the fact that the Northern Irish government then has to explain it to the people in Whitehall. So famously or not so famously, it's certainly not picked up in the Southern archives. Whenever you have Lemass meeting O'Neill, a lot of the Lemass emphasis is on North-South trade. The trade, of course, is reserved matter for the British government under the Government of Ireland Act 1920. So the Northern Irish government then say, we can't do this. So actually, what actually happens is that the Board of Trade in London essentially turns O'Neill an envoy for the Board of Trade. And so he wears that hat. Now, you won't pick that up if you read the Southern sources, but it's there in the file. And again, it's all these sorts of little quirks going on about the constraints under which the Northern government is trying to operate. Constraints which the Southern government, of course, doesn't have. Perhaps we can speculate more upon those problems of devolution. But anyway, again, I apologize if my answer is kind of rambling, but anyway.
Very interesting. So I think Kieran wants to say.
Thanks, Emil. Sorry, just a couple of points. So one, I question any, no one said it kind of outright, but assumptions that economic development was actually successful. Whitaker was successful. We went to the EEC in '73, which we might not have had he not been there. But economic development talks about things like, you know, using more fertilizer, increasing productivity in farming so that gets invested. I don't think any of that happened. And I haven't seen any convincing suggestion that it was. By the mid-60s, Whitaker himself is saying, no, industry is now taking over. So implicitly, that's a recognition of the fact that the strategy in economic development didn't work. He spent the rest of his life telling us that it did work incredibly successfully, but I think we should question that. Two was the interlinkages with academics. So yeah, throughout the 60s, Whitaker gets in Paddy Lynch, Carter, who I know Graham and I are both big fans of, and Leighton Ryan. Carter had brilliant suggestion in the early 60s of setting up a huge R&D facility for industry here. And it was shot down by finance because they said it was too expensive and the CSO. It would have been brilliant. And one of the fears was Industry and Commerce said that there wouldn't be that industry here they didn't have the way to use it, even if it was there, and they wouldn't pay for it. I think it was Lynch, it was either Lynch or Ryan, writes in the mid-50s as well, the state should start seeing its job to kind of stabilize the economy, run pro-cyclical policies or counter-cyclical policy rather than just balancing its books. And again, I suppose that's not really recognized. In his meetings with them, Whitaker would just sit down and they'd kind of make predictions for what would happen over the coming year, which I think was a real waste of their talents. What they really actually had to provide, to offer, wasn't taken up on. And Whitaker didn't bring anyone else into the department into that. So when Charlie Murray takes over in 1969, it's scrapped. They go, oh sure, it's outlived its usefulness. We have an IEC or whatever now, we don't need it anymore, which is a real shame. It would have been great. And then the last point on the Buchanan report, really interesting. It comes across in the Forward White and Ray McSharry book really well, but White, who was head of the IDA, describes he's like finance were concentrationists to their core, and the IDA always wanted to scatter, and that every kind of hamlet in the country would have, you know, a multinational company in it. One thing that I kind of talk about, and it comes across, and you never really get to it, is that the Department of Health in 1970 points out you can't provide decent health services to a very dispersed population. It's too expensive. You can't have a university hospital in every town. So there's a massive cost to that, and living standards are lower, and that's never discussed. So it's a real, like the Buchanan, it had sympathetic ears in finance among the civil servants, but among kind of the IDA and among the politicians, there was never any appetite for that because it suited them to just shut companies everywhere they could. Thank you.
Okay, so we're coming up to the hour. I don't know if people have burning statements or questions. This is your chance. Yes, please.
Hi, Alison Byrne, Section for University. Thanks very much. I thought that was really, really interesting. I just want to go back to one or two things you were talking about earlier, Esmond, and I think it was picked up by Francis and Frank. We were just making the point that economic development was obviously going to be more successful because it was, from within the system, a business servant or whatever. And then obviously the corporate lives being externally developed didn't get the same, and all was quite negative, obviously, didn't get the same positive response. But just around the same time when Corporate Isles was published, so I suppose it was completed, I think, in 1955. During that decade, there were 3 other internal reports within Northern Ireland. So there was 3 working groups on unemployment. Exactly, the unemployment issue was huge up there. There was one in 1952, a small one in 1955, and then the one that most people probably are aware of, the Hall report in 1962-63. Now, the Hall report was an internal document, and it was developed, I think, by senior civil servants both in Stormont and in Whitehall. But that ended up basically no better insofar as there was there was no kind of clear strategy coming out of that anyway. So even though it was an internal document, it didn't deliver, I suppose. So I think, when we were involved in a paper, it was half a century of policy papers chasing the wind. I think we talked about the Hall report in that regard as well. So I'd be interested of what you might think of that. And there's one last point. By the time the Hall report came out in 1962, they did actually refer to economic development. So there was kind of a switch in terms of the attitude in the north towards the south. We were beginning to get a little bit more developed and we were taken more seriously. So there is some reference to the south in that Hall report in 1962. And there's also some references to the policy in the south, but it's actually not documented in the report. The interest to comments.
Hello, thank you very much. So did you hear that?
Sorry, the acoustics are, I don't know about Esmond, but the acoustics are really bad there. So I was picking up bits and pieces. Is there?
So basically, there's a reference to a Hall report that you wrote about, which was focusing more on unemployment and whether this influenced your analysis in this paper.
Yeah, no, I was just making the point that the Hall reports.
The Hall report's later. Is that the question?
Yeah, no, it's 1962, but it was an internal document. And I suppose the point we were making earlier was that an internal document might be more successful, but I don't think the Hall report was, because it wasn't clear either, I suppose.
Did you get that? So it's an example of an internal report that wasn't actually successful because you were making the point about Whitaker being inside the fence.
Well, the whole report's not. Well, the whole report. Part of the issue that the whole report is at the time the lack of coherence in the Northern Irish government about the whole report. About at the time you have the Matthews report about spatial planning and the whole report about finance, and they're not allowed to cooperate with each other. But yeah, the whole report. I mean, Esmond with David Hitchens, the paper Chasing the Wind. I mean, the template of Isles and Cuthbert is felt within the whole report. I think the whole report, I mean, there's nothing in terms of scope and originality of any of the subsequent reports that matches Isles and Cuthbert. I mean, Isles and Cuthbert's a much bigger report. it's reviewed in the Economic Journal. We didn't get into that. I mean, I think these other reports build very much on Isles and Cuthbert. And again, as I said, Isles and Cuthbert's original, Isles' original analysis, you could trace back to 1952 or even earlier, 1946. So I think that Isles is very much, if I understand the question correctly, Isles and Cuthbert is very much the pioneering report. But again, I apologize about the acoustics. I couldn't quite hear all the points that were made. I don't know if Esmond can hear.
Yeah, I thanks for the point. And it's very useful, obviously, to raise the record of the subsequent reports in the Northern Ireland economy, and there were a whole host of them. And as Graham alluded to, myself and others have written about this, a litany of policy documents in Northern Ireland, like Hall, like Cairncross, Matthews, Quigley, Department for Economic Development in the 1990s, and so on and so on. Now, yeah, I suppose it's fair to say having a civil servant right report clearly of itself, a sufficient ground for success, but I think sometimes it can be helpful. And perhaps it's also instructive to look at the example of the Quigley report on the North End economy, written by Sir George Quigley in 1976. He was the permanent secretary, I think, of the Department of Commerce at the time. That report was influential, and he clearly was an insider. Now, there's a much broader question about whether the long-run effects of the policy emphasis that there was in Quigley's report, whether in the long run it was wholly helpful to the Northern Ireland economy or not. That raises lots of big questions. But I suppose it was written in the particular context, the very worst period of the Troubles in the mid-1970s, and therefore his argument that you needed an extraordinary level of state intervention and subsidy of the private sector to maintain employment levels. It's quite understandable why a senior servant within the Northern Ireland system was arguing that, but arguably it did have certain long-run effects which depressed the growth potential of the economy.
Thank you very much. So I think I'll hand it over to the Secretary just to close out. And,
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Just a couple of announcements then. So I've taken note of who made contributions to the discussion. Thank you very much for those. So that I can record them properly, can you email me with those comments, Secretary at Sissy? And then to the future. So the next ordinary meeting, the second ordinary meeting is scheduled for December the 8th. And that's going to be a symposium on cost of living. And so details on that will follow. And then after that, the third ordinary meeting, which is scheduled for January 26th, and we'll be dealing with the Barrington Prize then. And our intention is to award the recent winners of the Barrington Prize, because we haven't been able to do that in person due to COVID. That's the intention for January.
okay, no, thanks very much. So thanks very much for everyone coming here today. So hopefully people think about coming to the RDS. It's very pleasant, and we're doing the hybrid, but we are going to continue the hybrid because one of the positives of COVID was having people from all over in an all-Ireland approach coming online and being able to do what we did today, which I think is really excellent. So we'll continue that, but it's also very nice to come in person because we're going to have a coffee now and a chat, etc. So please, Kira Whelan is the new editor of the journal. So we publish everything in the paper's proceedings. So we publish the paper and the discussants, but also everyone's statement. So please do send that into secretary@sissy.ie. And knowing Kira, this is going to be turned around a lot faster than I did in the previous years. Without further ado then, again, thanks very much for everyone coming online and everyone here, and we'll see you December 8th for a very interesting seminar on the cost of living. Thank you.